All right, we're in our last chapter for 8th grade. We have angles, transversals, and triangles. So in this unit, there's four main things we're going to talk about: interior and exterior angles of triangles, corresponding sides of angles, corresponding sides and angles, parallel lines and transversals, and then congruent and similar triangles. So some of this will seem familiar. You've learned a little bit of it in 7th grade. A lot of it's going to be new. So let's get through this. Go ahead and move on to the first part. We got to go over some old basic geometry concept stuff you should all know. So we'll go through this pretty quickly. So point is a position in space represented by a dot. So you could have all these different points: point A, Z, D, point K, point L. A plane, you should all know that a plane is a flat surface that extends on forever in all directions. So, while I'm going over this, go ahead and make sure you've got out paper, you have out your notes. Some of this you'll need to write down. Make sure you have. I'll let you know which parts to write down. The stuff that's review, you don't need. You can write down the new stuff. So you should already know what a plane is. For example, the floor of the classroom is a plane. It's a flat surface. All right, the wall's a plane. All right, your XY, when you look at a coordinate grid, your X and Y axis makes a plane. Line segments, you should already know a line segment is a part of a line with two endpoints and all the points in between. Now, the reason we're going back over all of this stuff is mainly to remind you how to label them. Because as we go over the new content for this chapter, you've got to make sure that you can label line segments, lines, rays. You have to make sure you answer them the correct way, because you might be able to look at it, see the answer, but if you don't label it correctly, it's going to be counted wrong. So if you have line segment CD, do you remember how you write that as an answer? How would you label that? If you have line segment CD, you wouldn't just write CD, you wouldn't write line segment CD. There's a symbol you use. All right, so if you remember it, awesome. If you don't, make sure you write this down. So if you want to label line segment CD, and then if you have line segment EF, you label them by just putting the letters in alphabetical order. So CD, and then if it's a line segment, so if it has endpoints on each end, it stops on both sides, you just draw a line over it. So you draw a line and then CD. So this is line segment, it stops. So just line segment, CD. So this would be, or you can write it the opposite way. So line segment DC, most of the time you want to write it in alphabetical order, but you can flip it and write it the other way. So there are two different ways to write this one. So for this, you have line segment EF, line segment FE. You can write it either way. The preferred way is alphabetical order, but either way is fine. And you just got to make sure you know to put the line over it. So then what about if you have a line? It's a straight path extending without end in two directions. So if you have this line right here, anybody remember? Do you remember? Think about it. How do you label that? So if you have line RT, you put the RT and then you draw the line over top and make sure you put the arrows on both sides. So that's line RT. So if there's a dot in the middle for S, now there's lots of different ways you could label this line. This could be line ST because it goes forever in both ways through both points. Or you could have line RS. We go back, you could have line SR, you could have line TR. There's lots of different ways you could write it. Just make sure you remember, put the arrows on both sides. Array. Array is part of a line that begins at a point and then it extends forever in the other direction. So it starts at a point and then goes forever in one direction. So then if you want to label that, all right, we have ray A or you have ray K. And to label it, you just have an arrow pointing in one direction. So we have an A because that's the starting point, and then it's going forever. And you always draw this to the right. So then we have ray K. So you just have a line on top, arrow on just one side since it's a ray. All right, so make sure you know how to label these. Make sure if you need to write it down so that when you go to answer your questions, you know which one to use. So you could also, if there's 2 points, you could also put ray AB and use both points. Either way is correct. You will have some questions that might say, okay, you have ray AB, and give you this picture and say, show me 2 ways that you could label it. And you'd have to be able to write it both ways. All right, so then this could also be ray JK. All right, congruent. Most of you know what congruent means. If something is congruent, then the 2 line segments are exactly the same length. So if 2 things are congruent, that means they're exactly the same. They're the same size, same length, same everything. They're identical copies. So if I have line segment CD and it's equal to 3, it's 3 units long, and then I have line segment EF, then you can write that they are congruent, and this is the symbol you use. And this is something you need to write down. Make sure you know. If you want to label something that's congruent, you can't just put line segment CD equals line segment EF. You have to use the congruent symbol, which is the equal sign, and then it has the little squiggle on top of it. All right, line segment CD is congruent to line segment EF. So if EF equals 3, or if CD equals 3, then EF also equals 3. So that's some of the type of questions you'll have to answer. So make sure you know the symbol. All right, a review of angles. An angle, 2 rays that begin at the same point. So if I have that ray and this ray, and they both start at point C, we now have an angle. And that's important because it's going to ask you, if it asks you to label one of the sides of an angle, you have to label this. What would you call this side of the angle? You would have to label it as ray CD. So it's important to know that an angle is made up of 2 rays. All right. The angle where they start from is called the vertex. So the vertex is at C. A lot of this should be review. So if you remember it, awesome. If you don't, make sure you are paying attention and you've got this. So we have an angle, the ray CD, ray CE, and then the vertex is at C. All right, so name the angles. So another thing you've got to be able to do, looking at this angle, there are 3 different ways you could name what this angle is. So I've got an angle, I've got vertex at A, point B, C. This is ray AB, ray AC. You could call this angle A. So when you have an angle, you can name it by just using the vertex only. So angle A. You can also name it by going around the outside and naming the points. So this is the symbol for angle. So you make sure you put angle, angle, BAC. The vertex is always in the middle. So if we do angle BAC, you can also label it as angle CAB, as long as the vertex is in the middle. All right. So like I said, vertex has to be in the middle. You could not call this angle ABC. That wouldn't work. You got to make sure you put the vertex in the middle. All right, last thing we're going to talk about in the notes today, we have different types of angles. We're going to go over a whole bunch of different types, but today we're just going to go over these 4. And for a lot of you, this just should still be review. A lot of you should know from 7th grade some of these angles. So we're going to go over adjacent angles, vertical angles, supplementary, and complementary angles. So adjacent angles are side-by-side angles. They share a common ray. So if you have 2 angles that are right next to each other and they share a side, they share one of the rays, then they're adjacent. Just like my classroom is adjacent to Miss Parker's room next door. We share a wall. My classroom is adjacent to the computer lab downstairs because my floor is their ceiling. We share a side. My room is adjacent to the hallway. We share a wall. So adjacent is when 2 angles are side by side, they share a ray. All right, so these are examples of adjacent angles. They all share a side. These are not adjacent. Those two are next to each other, but they don't share a side. This angle and this angle have one in between them, so they don't share a side. They share a vertex, but that's not good enough. Same thing over here. This angle and this angle share a vertex, but they don't share the same sides. So these are not adjacent. When two lines intersect, which means when two lines cross, they make vertical angles. Vertical angles are opposite from one another. So 75 and 75, they're opposite. You have two lines cross. The angles across from each other are vertical angles. So 105 and 105. What do you also notice about vertical angles? They're always going to be congruent, which means they're always going to be equal. So if this one's 150, then its vertical angle match has to be 150. If this one's 30, then its vertical angle match has to be 30. Now, supplementary angles, you should remember, you've already gone over this before. Supplementary angles add up to 180 degrees. So supplementary adds up to 180. So adjacent and supplementary angles are also known as a linear pair. So that's another thing that you would call them a linear pair, because when you put them side by side next to each other, they form a what? They form a straight line, which means they are a linear pair. So these two, 120 plus 60 is 180, so you know they're supplementary. These two are also supplementary, 40 plus 140 is 180, but they're not adjacent. So you can have supplementary angles that are next to each other, and you can also have supplementary angles that are not next to each other. If you have two angles, they add up to 180, whether they touch or not, they are supplementary. So supplementary angles add up to 180 degrees. Complementary angles add up to 90 degrees. So these two are adjacent and complementary. 30 and 60 makes 90. These are complementary but not adjacent. They still add up to 90. So complementary angles add up to 90 degrees. All right, so practice time. We're going to go through some examples. And then if you are the in-person algebra class, I'm going to have your assignment on the last slide. If you're part of the OLA class watching this, you can ignore the last slide with the IXLs on there because you won't be doing all of those. Those are the ones that they're going to be doing in class today, the in-person class. So practice time. Directions. Identify each pair of angles as vertical, supplementary, complementary, or none. So you don't have to write these down. Just kind of look at it and decide, okay, what do you think? We got these two angles, 120 degrees, 60 degrees. They're next to each other. They make a straight line. So these would be, what do you think? They would be supplementary angles. Supplementary add up to 180. Make a straight line. 120 plus 60 is 180. All right. Look at these. What do you think? You have 30 and 60. Vertical, complementary, supplementary. They are 60 plus 30 is 90. Complementary angles. All right, if you look at these, you've got 75 and 75. You have two lines crossing. They're on opposite sides. They're equal to each other, so they are vertical angles. All right, we have two angles that aren't touching, 40 degrees and 60 degrees, so they are none of the above. 40 plus 60 is 100. There is no special thing for two angles adding up to 100 degrees, so they are none of the above. All right, what do you got? 60 degrees, 60 degrees. They're opposite from each other. Two lines crossing. Vertical angles. All right, 135 and 45. We have two lines crossing, but they're not opposite from each other, so it's not vertical. They're next to each other. They add up to, what's 135 plus 45? You get supplementary angles. 135 plus 45 is 180, so they are supplementary. All right, if you look here, we have a whole bunch of different lines. We have two lines crossing. We have an angle and another angle that make a straight line. These two angles right here make a 90-degree angle. So if you have 25 and 65, they're next to each other, so they're adjacent. If you add them together, you get complementary angles. They add up to 90 degrees. All right, if we look at these two, we got a 90-degree angle and a 50-degree angle. What do you think? What's that give you? None of the above. There is no special angle for 90 plus 50 is 140, so there's no special thing for 140 degrees. All right, then you'll also have some questions where you'll have to find the missing angle. So you would look at this and you'd have to decide, okay, what type of angles are these? They're next to each other. They make a straight line. So they would be supplementary, which means they would add up to 180. So then you would have to do 180 minus 45 to find the missing angle, which would be 135 degrees. All right, so look at this one. Pause the video if you need to. What would that missing angle be? So if you pause the video and solved it, you would look at these and you would say, okay, they make a 90-degree angle. They make a right angle, which means they should add up to 90 degrees. So they're complementary angles. So what is 90 minus 65? 25 degrees. All right, what's this missing angle going to be? If you look at them, you would see two lines crossing. So they're vertical angles, and vertical angles are always equal to each other, 35 degrees. All right, what's this missing angle? You have two angles, they're adjacent, they're next to each other. They make a straight line, so they would be 180 degrees supplementary. 180 minus 50, 130 degrees. All right, we've got two parallel lines. We have a transversal going across them. You have 140 degrees. We have a missing angle over here. So what type of angles are these? All right, we've got two lines crossing and they're opposite sides of it, so that makes them vertical. And what do we know about vertical angles? They are equal to each other, 140 degrees. All right, now we have a rectangle. We have a diagonal going across it. So these two angles make what? They make a right angle, so they're complementary, which means they add up to 90. 90 minus 40 is 50 degrees. 50 degrees. All right, so if you are from the OLA class, you can ignore all these. You're not going to have to do all these. If you're in the in-person class and you just watched these notes, you did your pre-test today, then you watched the notes. So now the rest of the class period is going to be spent working on these IXLs. Some of you, I'm sure, will get through these pretty quickly and finish them all. Some of you might not. The goal is not to, so you don't have to get all of them done, but you do need to work quietly and work the whole time and get as much as you can done. I will be checking to see on IXL how much time you spent on it. I'll be talking to the sub to make sure you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. So make sure you work on these. Make sure you pay attention that these first two are in geometry. So make sure you go to the geometry section for those two. Then these two are in the 8th grade section. And then you finish up with these two in the geometry section. Now it says get them to 100. If you just want to get them to 90, and then if you get finished, go back and then get them to 100, that's fine. The main thing is that you just work the whole time and make sure you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. So other than that, good job. And that is the end.